Welcome to a very special series on the St. Luke's podcast that is all about deconstructing faith. We're your hosts, Jon Jones and Mindie Moore, and we've been through the process of deconstructing and building back faith, and we love to talk about it with you. This is a 6-part series where we can go deeper into some of the elements that make deconstruction difficult, but also so very worth it. Whether you're at the beginning of your deconstruction journey or you've been doing this work for decades, we're glad you're here. Well, hey, everyone. We are so excited to be with you on this first episode as we talk about deconstructing and reconstructing our faith. If we haven't met you yet in real life, maybe we'll never meet you.
Ooh.
Maybe you'll only hear us on this podcast. I don't know. But my name is Mindie Moore, and I am on the staff of St. Luke's UMC in Indy. I am our Midtown Campus Pastor, and this is probably my favorite subject to talk about.
This is your favorite subject?
I really love it.
Right.
I'm a nerd.
Excited.
And Jon, who are you?
I am the Senior Director of Discipleship at St. Luke's North Campus, and I guess technically over Midtown's
all places.
Discipleship. I don't know.
Places.
I do some stuff here.
We both do some stuff. And one of the things that we noticed we had in common is that we love to talk to people about faith and big questions and things that we're trying to work through as we navigate the complexities of taking stuff that you used to believe and sort of sorting it out and finding something new.
Yep.
And so the big, I guess, catalyst for this whole series of conversations was we did an event back in September, a live event where we told our stories, we got Q&A, and then we thought, okay, an hour and some change.
Just not enough.
It's probably not enough to talk about a big topic.
Yeah.
Yes. So we said, let's do about 6 episodes of a podcast where we can go deeper. We can have a different kind of conversation, and people can really listen to this on their own time.
Yeah.
So that's why we're here.
That's perfect.
Yeah.
So tell me, Mindie, deconstruction. Break it down for me. Why are people talking about it right now? What's the deal on it?
It's such a hot topic.
I know. You see it everywhere.
Yeah.
Like if you're ever on the socials, I mean, it's popping up everywhere. People are throwing the words around. How are you defining it, and why are people talking about it?
Well, I think if I was going to define deconstruction, and I always say this is Mindie's definition, because once I did Google this for a sermon, and I was like, ooh, I'll have like a really snappy definition.
To try to find a definition?
And you cannot find one good one.
Oh.
No.
That was not the answer I was expecting.
It's always tinged with opinions.
Yeah.
So that's what's so interesting about this topic to me.
Very interesting. Yeah, because I feel like when it comes to deconstruction, if you're listening and you weren't at the event or something like that, you know, deconstruction is really unraveling the bits and pieces of how your faith was constructed, usually as a child probably, or in your teen years, or based in your family or something like that. But it's coming to a point where the experiences that you're having in real life don't necessarily match up to what you were taught, and trying to figure out how do you reconcile those two things, which you and I have both had to do that. We might be in like ministry ourselves and, you know, at churches, but we've actually done deconstruction processes.
Absolutely. And I would actually say maybe one of the reasons I'm still in ministry is because
100%.
I've had this
100%.
experience. And I think because I've had the freedom and the tools to do exactly what you're saying. So I think if I was going to define deconstruction, it would really be just taking the faith that you have and looking at it and saying, okay, what fits? Yep. What have I outgrown? What do I need to set down? What do I maybe need to like throw as far away from myself as possible?
There's a lot of that.
Yeah, and that's okay. But then we don't stop there.
Right.
We build something different. We build something new. We build something that is more true to who we are in this current season.
Yeah, for sure.
And so that's why I said this is my favorite thing to talk about.
So, all right. So back up the train a little bit. For everybody who wasn't at the event, give us just like a snapshot. Where are you deconstructing from, or where did you deconstruct from?
Yeah. So I feel like I have the most twisty-turny faith background. Like there is no clear path forward. So I'll make it short because you don't have all day.
We've got 3 hours here.
We have 3 hours. That's what we are. So for me, I grew up sort of a mix of very, very conservative Lutheran when I was teeny tiny. Grew up in Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Synod. Only my most committed of the Lutherans will probably even know what that is.
All right.
But grew up in this very conservative church environment, and then sort of experienced a lot of like freedom and growth as I went into youth group, went to a non-denominational church. We like stood and we lifted our hands. There was a fog machine. I mean, you knew, but I just want to confirm that for you.
Well,
there
you said non-denominational,
yes,
so I assumed.
You knew, and it was the early aughts, so there was definitely a fog machine.
Well, the Holy Spirit only shows up when there's a fog.
I mean, I feel that sometimes, yes. But that was how I spent, my teen years. And it was in some ways very freeing, but it also was still very theologically conservative. It was women are not to be in ministry. We don't affirm LGBTQ people. We definitely don't talk about like race or any of that stuff. I mean, it had a very set framework.
Yeah.
And then I went to college. And I did this internship in Chicago working at a church in the city.
Oh, okay.
And I just started to meet people whose stories did not fit what I had been told. And so I would say for me, if I could sum up why I started deconstructing, it was because God put people in front of me who had different experiences and different ways of experiencing Jesus.
Yeah.
And I just started to ask some questions.
Ooh, asking questions. It's a dangerous.
It is. A slippery
practice.
Slope. Is that what they told me growing up?
It gets you into trouble. And I love me some trouble.
Absolutely. But I feel like your story is a little different than mine.
Yeah, it is a little different because I grew up on the West Coast. And so on the West Coast, it's not assumed you go to church at all. Like if you go to church, you're kind of like a freak or a geek or something like that. And so I grew up in a very conservative family as well, conservative kind of faith practice. But my parents were weirdly liberal in two ways. In one, they were like hardcore feminists. And two, they were very involved in like racial justice kind of stuff. And so I have this weird mix of like very progressive and yet simultaneously very conservative in my background. And, conservative politically, conservative socially, conservative theologically. And so for me, after having grown up in that for most of my life, I went to private schools, all that kind of stuff. I went to a public high school for the first time. And they taught us how to think, how to ask questions. And there were so many moments where all of a sudden I'm beginning to ask questions and primarily around science, right? And I'd grown up, where it's like, strict 7-day creation kind of accounts. And, God had put the dinosaur bones there just as a fun little thing for us to dig up, but maybe they weren't real, like the weird, like workaround stuff you can do. And all of a sudden and I'm in high school and I'm like, I don't think any of that's right, actually. I
You're asking questions.
Maybe science is accurate here. And so I go through high school almost living a dual life where in my daily school side, I'm pretty like secularly progressive type minded. And then I go to church and I continue to go down that path. And I knew it wasn't going to be tenable long term, but I wasn't sure what it meant. And so I just kind of held on to these two sides of myself. Because honestly, if I'm being real with you, like I was really worried that I would get like, basically excommunicated from the church for asking questions. Because I mean, I don't know what all of your experiences are, but my experience growing up in the church was not a ask questions kind of thing. It was here are the answers to the questions we don't want you asking. Take the answer and feel free to go with that. And
if you just hold on to those answers tight enough,
everything will be fine. That's your faith.
Everything's going to work out.
That's what faith is. Just holding on real tight to these answers that we gave you. And so for me, I was really worried about that. And so I ended up moving to Portland, Oregon, which at that point in time, at least, was the neighborhood I lived in was probably the most liberal neighborhood in the country. If it's not, it was second after Brooklyn or something like that. And I started, like you, meeting a ton of people who don't match up to my set of experiences and who didn't match this kind of heretical vibe that I thought they were supposed to have. And so that's kind of where my process kind of started, but I was actually in ministry as I was doing deconstruction.
And I think that is a big difference for us because for me, when I really got into, taking those parts and pieces away and trying to figure it out, I think I was pretty lucky because I was in seminary, which if you are not familiar with seminary, you basically get to pay to do that work. It's wonderful.
A lot of money to do that work.
And I think for me, it was a real gift because where I was in school at, I had friends who were all over the place theologically. And so there wasn't one narrative I was hearing. I was just hearing all these different experiences, even from my professors. I mean, I had Mennonite professors. I had Catholic professors. I had Presbyterian professors.
And we both went to the same seminary. We both went to Fuller.
Yes,
so big ups to Fuller Seminary.
And it was so cool to hear all these ideas and have to figure out, okay, well, where do I fit in that conversation? What do I actually believe? Not because someone told me I had to believe it, but because it resonates and I can feel the Spirit kind of doing something.
And you kind of had guides then a little bit in that process. Like people forcing the questions, so to speak, and yet challenging the answer sometimes.
Yes. I mean, I think especially about like my Old Testament professor. His name is John Goldengay, and he's so great. He's so great. So but I just remember he would say things to us that we would think they were so scandalous. You know, he'd be like, God doesn't have a plan for your life. And we all gasp because I'm like, no, I've literally been trying to figure out God's plan forever. What do you mean? And then he'd say, but God has a purpose. So let's reframe some of these things that you've been taught and told. Like, how could we look at them differently? And so there was always that invitation to look at it from a different angle. And that was a gift.
So did you feel as you were doing it then, because you're around other people who are maybe in similar bits and pieces. You have professors that are encouraging it. Did you feel a sense of tension then with kind of back home and what you're growing up with and the worry of like, hey, do I get like invalidated? Do I get pushed out? I mean, what were you feeling at that point?
Well, I think what was so interesting, so I don't think I said this at the top, but I'm from Indiana, like born and raised in Indiana, lived in Chicago for a little bit, lived in Pasadena for several years. But I think when you leave a place and you go do work and learn and change and grow and do all the stuff, and then you come back, that can be tricky. Because you love the people that are where you came from and who gave you a foundation of what you believe.
But it's disorienting.
And you're like, wait, I've had these experiences. I've had these conversations. Like, if I wasn't having them, I wouldn't be doing this thing the way I'm supposed to do it. But if we haven't gone to the same place, like, how do we connect?
That's where I had trouble too. Because, I'm working in ministry. Deconstruction had already started inside of me. I'd already like cut myself in half, so to speak, internally. And now all of a sudden at this conservative church that I'm working at, I had brought up once or twice little things here or there, maybe like trying to read a book, like a Rob Bell book or something like that. I know, right? And I remember very distinctly being told, you don't read that here because we don't want to introduce heresy into your theology or definitely not into the students you're serving's theology. And so all of a sudden there's this very authoritarian set of, hey, do not touch this. You touch this, you're out the door. And that's a scary thing, right? Because when your career is attached to your faith practice and all of a sudden you're realizing that you've had a split inside and there's a whole side of me that doesn't quite resonate with what's happening here. And the second I try to bring it up is the second that I get smacked down. That was scary for me, like legit scary.
So you really experienced that resistance when you tried to integrate it into your life and 100%. Ministry.
Yeah, because it was considered to be unorthodox. And, anything that was unorthodox could break the answers we're giving you. And it kind of goes back to what you're saying. They thought of faith practice at that point more like building a wall, where it's like if you take, this brick of how creationism works and take this brick of how, Jesus works right here and you put them all on top of each other, we can build a wall and protect you from all the bad things in the world. And then your theology is your faith and you just kind of hold on to it right there. And they were worried that I was going to pull bricks out of that wall that would make it crumble down. And to be fair, they were probably actually right. But I think what they didn't see was what could happen on the other side of it.
Right.
And what was odd for me too was I think there was this point inside of me of being like, hey, if I let go of everything, if I was to let go of my job, let go of this conservative side of me, what's on the opposite side of this? What's on the opposite side of deconstruction? And I know that's a question that a lot of people ask, right? Is if I was to unravel all the pieces to the puzzle, what's left in the end? And I don't know if you felt that, but for me, that was, it felt like a really heavy weight to still be engaged in a church, to still believe in God, to still really value what faith had to offer me, but somehow just realizing that the variation or the version or the box that it had been put in wasn't workable for me. And I didn't know what other boxes existed.
Well, and then I think there's a question, can God exist outside that box?
Oof, that's a big question.
I mean, because were we given the tools?
Right.
Or was it God is part of a box and I keep coming back to this word framework, but I think that's part of it. Like God exists within these things. And if you get rid of these things, then, you might get rid of God.
Right. No, entirely. And part of it, I think, was even the purity side of my faith of being like, well, I've created a pure faith, right? That, if I thought the answer was wrong, I would choose a different one. So it's obviously I got the perfect theology right, and God loves me more for it. And that was what my brain thought. And so part of me was worried that if I let go of this, one, does God still love me? And two, did I just waste my entire life? Like, because I'm in my mid-20s. I've been teaching the Bible and teaching theology to students. And I would say I was teaching stuff that now I do not even believe or variations on it where I would not agree with what I was teaching. And so you look back and you're like, man, did I create more harm than benefit? Is this God still going to love me if I decide to choose a different way of thinking about it? And am I going to get excommunicated into the wilderness? Who loves you at that point? And those are big questions to ask. And I'm sure most people ask those if you're going through deconstruction.
Yeah. I mean, I think that it's interesting because I think sometimes when we deconstruct, we are trying to come away from faith traditions that they maybe put a lot of foundation in fear. Like, if you ask this question, something bad's going to happen. If you move toward the dark side, like it's not going to go well for you. But there's also this element of fear when you're taking that stuff apart. Because you don't know what it's going to be like on the other side. And you don't know who's going to go with you. And
if anybody.
And I think the thing about faith, too, is we do so much of it in community. We do so much of it in like these practices and these rhythms. And so then if we change, we stand to maybe lose a lot.
We can lose community. We can lose our sense of self. We can lose our sense of purpose, our sense of what we've been creating or not creating inside of that. And I do think there is that side of like, am I going to see my greatest fears realized in the middle of this? And like you said, you're unraveling and you're like, hey, what am I pulling off? Is everything that I learned bad? Like, I went to a church that was, I would argue, fairly toxic. Like, the leadership there was toxic. The theology was toxic. The ways that they thought about how they treated other human beings or the value that they gave to other human beings was toxic. And when you start unraveling, you sit there saying, was there any good? Could anything good ever come of letting go of this?
And then hopefully you find out, there was.
Do you want the short version of the story? I really like being on the other side.
Yeah. Why? Why do you like that?
I would have to say that once I deconstructed, one, I began to own my faith, and two, I actually met God. That on the opposite side of my faith, I didn't know God or trust God. I knew things about God and trusted things about God and held on to those as being faith versus actually knowing God. And that completely changed when I started unraveling and tearing down those walls.
Yeah, so I would agree with you. I am happy to be on the other side of that. And I think for me, it's because there's a lot of freedom and joy.
Yeah.
And I would not say experienced a lot of freedom and joy in a lot of my youth and young adulthood as a Christian. I mean, and I've grown up in faith spaces since birth, right? So like I've always been part of church. And, I just remember, and I might have told you this story once, Jon, but when I was in the Lutheran church and we would do communion, what they said every time, they're like, if you've even had a fight with your spouse on the way to church. Don't come to the Lord's table.
Right.
If you
bring
harbor
judgment on yourself.
right. And this whole community. Like it was so dire. And so I remember like for years and years and years before I would go receive communion, I would go through a laundry list of every sin I thought I had done. And of course, the ones that I can't remember too, Jesus.
Right.
Like you could forgive those too.
The sins of omission.
And it was like, let me just in 20 seconds, like try to repent for everything so I can come to this God who like says that they love me, but I'm terrified, terrified,
right?
And since deconstructing and doing a little work, and I will say becoming Methodist and like embracing this whole grace thing that is a big deal for us, yes, it's just totally changed the way I look at accessing God. You know, when you think of the fact that God's posture could be one of grace and love and kindness rather than like wrath and anger and judgment, you're going to approach that God differently.
Yeah. Is God angry or is God stoked to see me?
Right. Who wants to go with the angry person? I mean, but it does, you know, I can joke about that, but it kind of grieves me to think that for so much of my young adulthood, that was my orientation to who God was.
100%. Yep. And that was me too, is that I thought God was kind of like a stern kind of parent who was just waiting to catch you being out too late, or was just trying to see if you hid something under your bed, or, whatever. And that God was like always kind of peeking around the corner and like, ready to get me. And when I let go of that and began to realize that, no, he was actually really excited to see me, and that he was excited to forgive and excited to extend a deep sense of joy and love toward me, it was like wild. Like I wasn't sure what to do with that, because that's a totally different way of living. And yet what I also found along the way was that there were bits and pieces that I'd learned in the past, even from a toxic church, that God could still use in my faith going forward, which maybe that's a little bit of a good place to even call it for today, since we go into some kind of community stuff next time around. But that's what I started learning.
Yeah, I love that. So we're going to talk more in our next episode about community and faith practices, because I think that is where some of this gets really sticky for people.
100%.
It's one thing to say, oh, I'm going to engage in deconstruction, and I'm going to read a lot of books, and I'm going to listen to podcasts and do this stuff. But then it's like, where do I go on a Sunday? Like, how do I read the Bible? Can I sing that worship song that's about the blood and that uses, the he pronouns for God? Like, what do I do with all of that? And so we want to, in our next episode, go a little bit deeper into that for like some practical tools, some practical experience. And also because we know deconstruction does not just happen in our heads.
Yes.
It happens in our lives.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for listening.
Yeah. Come back next time and we'll talk about that.